There is something calling them all here.
We're going to do a bit of a deep dive. I don't know if it's a deep dive, but a discussion on a production company in Canada called Astron 6. And the reason these guys are on our radar is because you have been talking a lot about Psycho Gorman. I never got around to I never got around to seeing it. And then recently I watched The Void, which has been sitting there for a while. And then after watching it and thinking, fuck, this is some crazy awesome stuff, I realized it's the same guys. It's Astron.
Yeah, how dare you sit on The Void for that long?
Well, it's not that it's not that I sat on it for too long. It just all of a sudden, algorithm wise, it just popped up.
Nothing like from the picture in there, like, or the poster in there really like drew me into it, but it was a lot of like word of mouth kind of stuff, or from what I read on like other websites and stuff recommending it. But it's freaking awesome. I just watched it again recently. It's great.
It is pretty awesome, and there's a lot of stuff that I really like about it. First off, let's be well, we can talk about The Void first, because The Void, if you haven't seen it, it's great because it's a total throwback to 80s horror.
Yeah.
In that it reminded me a lot of Hellraiser.
And The Thing. I mean, because the effects are very thing. Like there's a cult that's outside of this hospital, the cop that brings somebody in, the guy's like infected, and so all these people start getting infected, and this thing turns into this thing-like creature, and then there's a cult outside that wants in. So it's sort of a mix between like Hellraiser and then The Thing, which is weird because Psycho Gorman is sort of a mix between Hellraiser and E.T.
in a way.
So they cross over, yeah.
In a way. But The Void, the cool thing about it, we could just talk about The Void for a little bit. Because first off, one, if I remember correctly, there was a little bit of really low budget CG type of stuff in it. Like people can't really even remember who it was, but essentially it was a lot of practical effects, a lot of puppets. And after the fact, so first off, I always loved that. It really reminded me of those like when you watch old school 80s horror films, and they're like, whether they were not even Friday the 13th, like Nightmare on Elm Street, the later ones did a lot of it where it's just like, oh, how did they do that shit? Like Freddy coming out of the TV.
Prime time, bitch.
Awesome. Yeah.
Or The Thing, which was
like the guy who did the effects. I think the guy who did the effects was really young at the time. I can't remember his name, but I remember when it came out, or Rob Bottin, I think it was, or I think it was Rob Bottin when he was really young. But when The Thing came out, it was called gore porn. Well, they labeled it as gore porn, and it was actually like an X rating, or they couldn't rate it because it was so violent. And then they just thought it was like trash cinema, and now it's regarded as a total classic. So
yeah. And also, if you think of the Hellraiser, like I remember seeing a lot of behind the scenes stuff on Hellraiser where we're talking about the Cenobites and how they did like the scenes where they're like ripping their skin off and stuff. Yeah, it's all practical.
Oh, and it's like, it's amazing, especially if you watch it now. I think it's like got much more respect now, because when you see all the computer stuff, and like, not to say that like the computer stuff doesn't take like a lot of time and effort itself or anything, but just like the handmade craft that is sort of, I think it's just because it's kind of rare nowadays. We used to see it all the time in 80s and 90s, but now we're barely seeing that many practical effects anymore. So when you see that throwback, it's really cool, because it's sort of like, if you watch, like, that's a weird analogy, if you watch a Disney cartoon and you see the hand-drawn animation where they used to spend 7 years putting that into effect, it's sort of like that with practical effects. Just so much more time. They have to get it right on the spot. They can't fix it in post as much. So it's just like, I think it has like much more of a three-dimensional quality to it. It draws you into it more, and it gets me more immersed in the movie when I see practical effects.
I remember reading, like, when I first figured out who Tom Savini was and Rick Baker, and you'd see them in Monster Magazine, or Fangoria would talk about, you'd see the behind the scenes. Like, I remember when we were in film school, my favorite thing to do was to kind of make like some sort of practical effect, whether it was like using an air compressor for blood, or kind of making some sort of makeup or mask and stuff like that. And I remember just being upset. Like, it's such a cool sect of, I don't know what you call it even, it's like an art form within an art form of creating practical effects that you just don't see anymore. They don't do it, but there were guys that were literally like the Rick Bakers and Tom Savinis of the world who had their shops and would create creatures. I actually knew there's a guy that we used to talk with when we did the blog with Dead Harvey, who does a lot of practical effects and makes makeup and stuff, and it's an art form, and when you see it and it looks good like it does in The Void, to me, it looks so much better. Like that weird fucking creature at the end that was chasing him down, like, and had the tentacles and the skull face and everything. I mean, to me that looked far more. I remember just going, oh, that's awesome. Like it's so much better than a CG effect when it's a practical effect like that. So first off, yeah, I mean, you described what The Void was about. And by the way, there's cult things, and the hospital, basically they go through some sort of chasm into into the void. But they purposely leave it completely ambiguous as to what actually is going on in the film.
Yeah, and as the Hellraiser nod too, that the doctor in there turns into sort of like that character Frank from Hellraiser that has all of his has all of his flesh ripped off, and he's just like sort of reminded me of that, like the skinless look, or like those Tool music videos with like the skinless characters on there. It had like that, like a little bit of a quality to it too.
So the main dude, the doctor. Yeah, it wasn't really Hellraiser-esque, but his whole thing was kind of like, which we've seen before, which was, I have found the fountain of eternal youth.
Yeah.
And it's here within the void. But what I mean is like the ambiguity was around like the big triangle. Like, what does the triangle mean? And
right.
I read afterwards, they're like, it doesn't really mean anything. We just kind of left that to you. Or what the hell's going on within this void? Why does this thing even exist? We've left it ambiguous. And I think that's kind of cool, because there's a lot of movies like that have that ambiguity, that leave you talking afterwards and trying to figure out what it's about, or at least gets you thinking about it. I mean, I think The Void was just like, we're talking, it's 5 years old now, and it is on, was it on Shudder?
I saw it on Tubi.
Oh, maybe it was Tubi. Maybe it was Tubi. Anyway,
it kind of bounces back and forth between streaming platforms, but yeah.
So you can find it anyhow. And even cooler was the fact that for The Void, they had apparently they had raised the money to make the movie itself, but then used Indiegogo to actually raise the money to make the monster creatures. And they were basically like, the more money we raise, the fucking more badass we'll make the creatures. And so obviously they did quite well on raising the money. And I think that's as indie as it gets, right? Like, hey, someone financed the movie and allowed us to make it, but we have to raise money for the special effects on it to make it work.
Yeah. What's great too is that like the completely different tone that's in this movie from Psycho Goreman. Like they're two complete, like there's a lot of like the same kind of like puppetry and effects and stuff like that. That's consistent, but this one is much more of a straightforward tone in this movie, and kind of ominous tone, creepy. Whereas Psycho Goreman's much more of like a comedy,
It was nice meeting you.
It would be nicer if you were dead.
All right, bye.
But
100%, it is true, because they go down. I was looking at I've just kind of brought up a little bit here that so you can find the Indiegogo campaign that they did 5 years ago. They raised $100,000 through the Indiegogo campaign. And The Void is an original horror film from writer-director team Stephen Kostansky and Jeremy Gillespie, best known for their work as part of the Astron 6 collective that's also brought Manborg, which we can talk about later.
Manborg's awesome. I just watched that the other day.
Father's Day. They also obviously have done Psycho Goreman, and they're also design and FX veterans of major Hollywood productions like Pacific Rim, RoboCop, and NBC's The Hannibal. So these guys are FX guys that came out to do this, and they're indie guys. They don't really talk about it. So they're
well, he did, like Steven did effects on Clown, which is actually a pretty sweet movie if you've seen that one. And then Suicide Squad.
It's again, there's a lot of guys who are, it's just kind of cool. Like that to me is indie. There's a lot of guys, and I know some other guys who started in effects and then got into this because they basically want to display their effects. So that to me is as indie as it gets. So now when I did the research and all of a sudden I found out that these were the guys that did Psycho Goreman, I was like, well, I gotta watch Psycho Goreman. So now, first off, let's talk about Psycho Goreman a little bit. It is definitely so these are the same guys that did The Void, did Psycho Goreman. And Psycho Goreman, which just came out last year, I think. You can find it again. I think it's on Shudder. I'm just guessing.
It is on. It did get added to Shudder recently,
But first off, they, from what I've read, raised about $500,000 from a financer. Basically, they sat down. The guy came up with the idea, pitched it to a guy that invests in these movies. He gets the $500,000. Now in Canada, there's tax credits, so they can leverage that a little bit more. Plus, I don't know if they did anything on Indiegogo, but these guys are indie guys and leveraged a whole bunch of stuff to get it done. It's a cool. So basically, the concept was that you have this evil overlord monster.
Yeah.
You know, think Thanos, but a little goofier.
Yeah. He sounds just like Doug Bradley from Hellraiser.
We'll tear your soul apart.
So he does sound like Pinhead. It's hilarious.
Don't worry.
Be worried.
These kids are digging in their yard. They're playing games. They're digging in the yard, and they come across this like gem sort of thing that controls Psycho Gorman. And so they can control him. So he's been buried and lying dormant, and they can control him and make him do things, and which really annoys him. And so it's sort of like you're watching a movie that's focused around kids. You think you're going to be watching E.T., and then it turns into Hellraiser. So these like the kids from E.T. are commanding Pinhead from Hellraiser, which is hilarious, which is a great like concept. But my favorite part of this was like all just like the background puppets they had in it, because
many puppets.
They have this galactic force that comes after Psycho Gorman that was trying to stop him, that comes after him. All these different character designs. That was my favorite part of the movie. That was super enjoyable.
And there's kind of weird throwbacks too. So so basically they find a Hellraiser Thanos mix buried, and she gets this gem that helps her control him. So basically over time now, over the course of the movie, it's basically Psycho Gorman befriends these two little kids, and
reluctantly, but he eventually
but comes around and gets in adventures. I mean, I loved it. It was almost Trauma-esque, where he laughs about turning the buddy into basically a massive brain blob with eyeballs. Then there was
this is some of my greatest work. Yeah.
Then there was like I kind of felt it was a original RoboCop throwback with the melted cop that was following around.
Then he turns into the creature and he's like all mutated and his fingers are all everything. Didn't that like he was driving the car and like that vat of toxic waste hit him through the car?
Yeah, that guy. It reminded me of that.
That totally reminded me of Toxic Avenger too. Yeah.
And then and he's constantly basically like, kill me.
Yeah. Right? Or Toxic Avenger or RoboCop ripped that off from Toxic Avenger, and this ripped that off from RoboCop, ripped it off from Toxic Avenger. Yes.
Yeah, sure. However you want to do it, but they had this basically zombie melted cop following around. That is, and there was just so many little effects, and the funniest part about them is some of them almost looked like they could have been taken from a kids movie, but of course there's actually a pile of gore around it. And what I thought was misleading is because it's Psycho Gorman, the title of the film is actually PG Psycho Gorman.
Well, that's the most hilarious part of it, because it's PG, but it's like an extreme R-rated movie.
Yeah,
like the humor very like almost PG-ish in a lot of spots too.
And I wonder if that
innocent humor reacting to like this extreme gore, which is funny, but
that has to be part of the joke, that it shows up as PG Psycho Gorman. And it's a hard R film, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it was hilarious. I mean, if you're into those types of films, you gotta check out Psycho Gorman. And I mean, it's pretty by the book when it comes. I mean, you're not like Void had a lot of ambiguity and was very serious. I don't want to say serious. It had a lot of ambiguity, but you're talking about a real like a hardcore horror film. Whereas this is just a goofy film. And so the script itself basically follows the storyline you would expect it to. So. But it's awesome, and so it's basically, and I mean, what's funny is it's won a pile of awards at Monster Fest, Sitges, and some other film festivals. So it's kind of well received too. Like people like it. So anyhow, I mean, I don't know what else to say about Psycho Gorman. I think both of these are kind of must-watch indie horror films. You got to find Psycho Gorman and The Void.
Yeah, they're kind of completely on opposite ends of the spectrum, horror movies, but they will reward you with great practical puppet effects in both of them.
Oh, 100%. And you can, I mean, and then you kind of like between the two, you kind of really get what these guys are doing. So now, taking a step back, we'll talk about, and then it's basically when I watch both of them and realize that they're leveraging Indiegogo, they've got a financer. We're talking about low budget filmmaking where they get $500,000. They're probably leveraging tax credits, doing a lot of the effects themselves.
Yeah,
I mean, we're talking about real indie film, and if you actually think about what Hollywood's doing for even 10, 20, 30, 40 million, and you go watch The Void and think, Jesus, these guys did this for under $1 million. It's pretty impressive. It's impressive stuff. So so I had to do a deeper dive, and I found out that the company behind it is called Astron 6. They are a Canadian production company. They're 5 guys. They all come from sort of visual effects backgrounds. The background is essentially they were founded in 2007 by Adam Brooks and Jeremy Gillespie, and then they expanded to include Stephen Kostansky, who's the guy who's behind Psycho Gorman, and 2 other guys, and they're all kind of equal partners in this now. And basically, the whole idea is that they produce low-budget, 80s-centric indie films, often with comedy and horror, but essentially, you know, they're indie horror films. Originally, I thought that Adam Brooks was the guy. What was the name of the? And I'm totally wrong because I looked it up and it's not the guy. But about 10 years ago, there was another Canadian horror film that was a takeoff almost on. Was it Monster Slayer? Something Monster Slayer.
Oh, is it like Jack Brooks Monster
Jack
Slayer?
Brooks.
Like
Maybe
that?
that's
Yeah.
why I thought
I remember
it was.
that movie.
Jack Brooks Monster Slayer.
Yeah.
And I was like, is he the guy who was Jack Brooks Monster Slayer? Because I heard the name because it was around
So you
the
thought
same
that
time.
Adam Brooks made
Brooks.
Jack Brooks Monster Slayer?
Yeah,
or
for
do you
some
think
reason-
Adam Brooks was Jack Brooks Monster Slayer?
Yeah, I just kind of made the connection there, and there is
Yeah.
no connection there at all.
I think you're thinking Brooks and then Monsters and time.
I probably just saw the name Brooks and
Yeah.
made the connection to the two,
Yeah.
but they're both Canadian indie horror films.
Yeah.
So just a shout out to Jack Brooks Monster Slayer.
Oh, right on. Yeah. I remember
It's
that one.
awesome-
That suckered me in with the box art. I remember.
and it was kind of awesome because
It was cool. I dug it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So anyhow, originally I think their first film, which I have not seen from Astron 6, was Father's Day.
Oh, I saw that a couple of years ago. Yeah, I went back and revisited some of these
Mm-hmm.
before we did the show. So I watched The Void again, and then I watched Psycho Gorman again, and then I watched Manborg, and then I watched a movie that he did the effects on, which is called The Divide, which had
Divide is
Kostansky did the effects on, which has Michael Biehn in it, and he's very like grumpy old man in that movie.
So by the way, the divide is the movie that we were talking about last episode or the episode before.
That's right, about the 5 people in the bunker, right?
About the 5 people in the bunker.
Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's odd that it came up in this because I saw that too. So the divide is the one where I was talking about how some films or some filmmakers, and obviously these guys are could take a big idea and make it super small. And the divide was that.
Definitely. Yeah.
The whole divide took place in a bunker. It had Michael Biehn in it, but it all took place in a bunker. But it was about a post-apocalyptic world, and they all went, bonkers in this bunker. And I was struggling to come up with what movie it was, but I remember the concept, and it is the divide.
And this movie was like, no, it's like more like the makeup effects are for like, somebody gets injured and stuff like that, or horrific makeup effects, but nothing like puppety like in Psycho Gorman and The Void and everything, but nothing like supernatural and stuff. This is all like real world, just like people becoming monsters and turning on each other and going crazy. Michael Biehn in this movie though actually scared me. He was frightening in this movie. Usually like when you see him as a hero, it's like Kyle Reese in the Terminator movies or an Alien. He's always like super likable in those movies and so kind of like friendly, almost very heroic. But in this one, you're just like, oh man, I would not want to get on the wrong side of this guy. He'd kill me in a heartbeat.
Yeah, and it's good that it came up.
It was cool. It was cool that he did that movie though, because he's a completely different character.
But it's also very good that it came up that we found out the movie, because I would encourage every indie filmmaker to watch The Divide. Yeah, because it does such a good job at taking a huge idea and a huge concept and doing it on a super low budget.
Yeah, definitely.
Like if you even look at the cover art, it shows like fucking world burning and this big post-apocalyptic stuff. None of that is in the movie. None of it. It all takes place in a bunker that could literally, you could find, some sort of set somewhere and shoot the whole thing. It has huge concept, huge big idea, and it's done on such a low budget in a small space. The Divide, if you want to think of that concept, it's a perfect one to watch. So I'm glad that came up.
Yeah, definitely. And it's a cool movie. It's definitely worth watching too.
It's a very cool movie. It's been a couple of years since I saw it, but I remember it distinctly thinking, how cool is it that you take this huge, massive idea and do it on such a small budget and still feel like you're getting everything that big concept has?
It's kind of tough to watch in some spots because the humans turn into such bastards, like towards like the end of the movie. But that's probably what would happen in real life anyways. I mean, like people turn into bastards when they run out of when they think the toilet paper is going to run out, like let alone like the end of the world actually happening. Imagine like what bastards people would turn into in the end of the world.
It is exactly what would happen if you put 7 people in a bunker for that long.
Yeah, that's true.
100%.
Yeah.